The Mercedes W14, the brand new car from Brackley that was designed to solve the ills of the W13, a car that struggled more than Mercedes have since the start of the turbo hybrid era. But some of the concepts of the W14 continued through to 2023, and perhaps some of those ills have as well. We're going to take a look at what Mercedes can do to solve its problems with the car design. But first of all, we need to take a look at the car's design itself. And just looking at the rear of the car, it's pretty much a carryover. The rear suspension, yes, it's been revised, but it's still a pull rod rear suspension layout. The drive shaft clothed as ever within the lower wishbone housing. Then looking at the front suspension, similar story there. Mercedes have carried on with many of the concepts that we saw on last year's car. There's that pushrod actuated front suspension with these very distinctive bulges that sit around the inner pickup points, very beautifully sculpted as well. Some of the other concepts on the car are a little different. We saw that very distinctive front wing that Mercedes introduced at Austin last year, with those sticky uppy bits all arrayed across the span of the front wing. Well, Mercedes, curiously, haven't opted to use that technology for this car, at least not yet, while Ferrari has. There is now no dispute about the legality around them. Then looking further up the car, the roll hoop concept, that's pretty much the same as last year's car as well, and that carries back years and years with Mercedes. But the real interesting part comes around the side pod, of course. Mercedes have carried on their zero pod concept onto the W14, and this has been one of the biggest talking points of this car. A lot of people are putting the troubled performance of the W14 down to what is quite a different side pod concept. But in reality, the side pods alone do not make up the complete performance of a car. Just because this car looks a little bit different to everything up and down the pit lane, it doesn't mean that this just changing the side pods to a more conventional design will make this car work a huge amount better. You have to design a huge amount of other parts to work with those side pods. Now, Mercedes has changed the shape of the side pods quite significantly. If you look down here, you can see the shape of the radiator duct is much more rectangular than it was on the W13. That had that triangular duct. While this section that houses the upper side impact structure is much longer, much more deep than it was on the W13. But it's still very much a development of what we've seen before. But can Mercedes simply change the side pod? Well, the answer is yes, you can. Back in 2022, when Mercedes first rolled out the W13 in that pre-season running in Barcelona, most people have sort of forgotten about this, but the W13 had conventional side pods when it started. Then, coming to Bahrain, Mercedes took those conventional side pods off to reveal the zero pod concept. So it is entirely possible to just change the side pod on its own. If you change the side pod, you've got to change the floor edge because they interact with each other directly. Then you've got to change the treatment around the rear suspension, the brake cooling ducts, the rear wings. All of these parts will have to be changed because you've changed the side pod. The side pod doesn't work in isolation. The front suspension will need to change. These little details on the leading edge of the chassis, they need to change as well. And then something Mercedes has changed coming into this Grand Prix weekend. These little elements on the leading edge of the floor, these have been modified for this weekend. Will it make that big difference that Mercedes expects? Probably not, because the difference they're talking about is pretty drastic. So what can they do? Well, if you look at the other Mercedes engined cars on the grid, you've got the Aston Martin, you've got the Williams, and you've got the McLaren. Very different concepts of cars. So the Mercedes power unit, which is identical between all of the cars, can accept those different concepts. So they can redesign this section of the car. At the rear, you have the Mercedes transmission. Well, again, that's shared by Aston Martin. You can go to a very Aston Martin style concept with that. So could we see big Aston Martin style side pods with that big swoop down in the middle? I'm sure Mercedes is looking at that in the wind tunnel. Now, my theory on those side pods is that's all about drag reduction. And that copies a concept that was introduced by Ferrari on the F175, those deeply dished side pods. And you can see them swooping down. A bit of CFD work by some students who posted it on a forum, very good forum. They showed that concept, that shape, reduced drag. Well, if you look at this section on the upper bodywork of the Mercedes, you can see that exact same shape once again. Mercedes have taken inspiration from Ferrari sidepods on the F175 to create this drag-reducing shape. Now, in case you're wondering what these bulges are for, what's underneath them, absolutely nothing. Underneath these bulges, there is no mechanical parts whatsoever. That is purely an aerodynamic shape. But if you change the sidepods, you're going to have to change that shape as well. So the entire engine cover is going to have to change. And in fact, the Mercedes W14 you see in front of you here, if you just change the sidepods, you are pretty much going to have to change every other panel you can see visible on the bodywork of the car. And that's where you get into talk of B-spec cars. Well, in an era where you've got wind tunnel testing restrictions, you've got a cost cap, Mercedes is going to have to split its resources. Now, we have to assume that Mercedes is going to be running very close to the cost cap, because why wouldn't you if you can afford it? They're using all of their wind tunnel allowance. They've got very talented people working on the development of next year's car. Well, that development for next year's car with stable regulations, well, could Mercedes bring next year's car forward and not just introduce the W14B? Could they introduce the W15 a hell of a lot earlier than they first planned to? Even as early as Silverstone, perhaps. A completely new chassis seems a bit of an ask, and that is an expensive thing to do for the team. And if they did do that, they would be taking out of their budget for next season. Money spent this year, of course, on the development of next year's car, all goes on the cost cap for this year. Same with the aerodynamic testing restrictions. They are developing this car in the wind tunnel, but also developing next year. Well, if you switch this car off entirely, switch all of that effort onto the W15 and try to bring it to the track early, that is a possible way that Mercedes can solve their problems. But the details of this car are all going to have to change if Mercedes wants to take the fight to that end of the pit lane and Red Bull and Ferrari. Something they also need to get a handle on is the way the car uses the tyres, and that will involve a lot of work on the simulator, on setup changes. Mercedes has a vast sum of work to do, but let me assure you right now, that work is already well underway, and it was probably underway before this car even turned up in Bahrain for pre-season testing.